In this video, I'm going to give you the history of Victoria 3, as well as what makes it a good and bad game. This title has been probably Paradox's most contentious and split its fans right down the middle. I hope to analyze why exactly this game is probably the largest of uncut gems released by Paradox Interactive, while also being its most disappointing release to date. Let's get going. Like so many, I longed for a sequel to Victoria 2 as soon as the end of its development was announced in 2013. Victoria 2 was a game I enjoyed playing for a simple reason. I loved its raw potential, as unfinished as it was. Paradox Interactive, the publisher for this game, is amazing at giving us uncut gems and monopolizing the market by being the best gem cutter in the world. The cost? For every cut they make to refine the jewel of a game we all love, it costs us dearly. DLC built this company. Its premium DLC model is built on sound foundations, in theory, sadly discovered after the end of Victoria 2. Development on Victoria 3 in its earliest form actually began all the way back in 2014, not long after the end of the second. But it was not until 2017 that the development officially came underway. The game was co-led by Martin Anwar, also known as Wiz, a modder at Paradox Games, who was eventually hired by the company itself, like many in it. He is contentious by hardcore members of the community due to his actions in Stellaris, but his passion for games is without question. The other game lead is Michael Anderson. I'm sure I'm saying that wrong, I do apologize. Brought on exclusively to work on Victoria 3 with a background in computer science and IT work. They together sought to expand on Victoria 2 and create a game never before seen. A game where the main character is people, not a person, but whole nations, and how politics and economics affect them through time and change. Specifically in the dramatic upheaval and change of the Victorian era. This is what they envisioned and sought to create. I will be honest, I love the concept until, like so many people, the dreaded Concept of War dev diary was released. In it, I, like many, ignored all but one section. You do not move units directly on the map or make decisions about which exact units should be initiating battle, where, instead of being unit in province-based warfare in Victoria 3 is focused on supplying and allocating troops to front lines between you and your enemies. This seemed at first to suggest that war would be ignored entirely, brushed to the side, and perhaps even just locked behind a DLC, never imagining what they really had in mind. When Victoria 3 was released, it was really bad. Every core feature, every interesting mechanic, every creative choice was overshadowed by bugs. The game crashed constantly, it lagged. The AI was the worst on launch of any Paradox game I have ever seen, and that is saying something. And the war system was game ruining. On launch, I also played in the game's first roleplay game that I organized with my community, which was, as you can imagine, quite hectic. The multiplayer desyncs and stability was beyond bad and killed the game quickly, as well as the fact the game was so hard to learn, every one of us was just stuck trying to stop our people from starving to death. In addition to the overwhelming game-ruining bugs, there was a clear lack of feature polish. Many features were not complete, and many pillars of Victoria 2 were entirely missing, like international investment and the influence sphere system, which was my favorite in Victoria 2 and absolutely groundbreaking stuff. It took me several days of an intense single player before I got a hold of the core mechanics. But when I did see it. I understood what this game was going to be, and it made me accept what it was in the long term, but feel really angry at what a shadow of it we were given on launch, and that had been published in this state at all. This game was not complete, it's still not, 7 months after launch. It had no business being released as it was, but I knew it was going to probably become amazing, and that made me angry. The immediate thought I had was of Cyberpunk 2077, as I had similar feelings about that game when it launched. I loved what the goal was, what the vision was, what they were trying to make, but I was deeply disappointed and angry for what we were actually given on launch. Victoria 3 was 10 times worse in terms of issues and should have been delayed. I think many people, myself included, would have been a little annoyed but accepted if the company had said, listen, we need another 6 months or even a year because this game needed that. Let's get into what this game really suffers from and where to begin. There's so much wrong but I think all of it ties back to the most unforgivable component of this game's problem. The base game isn't enough. $50 on launch is a large amount. It's more than a lot of Paradox games in the past. $50 for a game title suggests a complete game with a lot of features that have polish. If the features offered on launch had more depth and had been properly tested, it would have been more reasonable, but they simply weren't. Paradox themselves define quality of their games as something that sells well and that players like. It did sell due to pushing the pre-orders, but even the most vocal supporters of Victoria 3 don't truly like what it is on launch. They like its parts of it, and they like what they think it's going to be. And that's not okay. This game is not worth the money. I mentioned before, I decided to hate this game when I read the concept of war. I really do mean that. I was quite angry. I love Hoi 4. I loved Victoria 2 until I saw it abandoned, as there's nothing worse than giving someone hope and choosing not to see that hope redeemed. Both of these games rely on micromanaging military, where you move your troops, control their composition, and in Hoi 4's case, you design the divisions entirely. When Victoria 3 dropped, I realized I had been wrong, but worse than that, its implementation was the worst part of the game. Warfare in Victoria 3 is really bad. It lacks depth, player choice, and is filled with bugs to make any core idea completely impossible to see. The biggest issue though entirely is the bugs. On launch, frontlines teleported everywhere when they worked at all. They split into hundreds of pieces, alongside a host of other issues. It was frankly game ruining. And even now, 7 months after launch, they're horrible, and the game designers themselves are talking about the need to address this. Though it's nowhere nearly as bad as it was on launch, to be fair. War was not supposed to be the focus of the game, but somehow it still managed to ruin it almost entirely. The lack of depth is clear. Your control over type is reduced to simple production methods gotten by technology. Your generals randomly roll certain moves that act like an elaborate system of rock, paper, scissors, with the only interesting element of them being the political impact and traits. It just needs more. It's really as simple as that. And lastly, player choice. Victoria 3 is not a war game, and that I now do support in theory. But to have almost no involvement by the player on the macro level as intended is an issue. Your involvement in war period is limited to simply assigning generals to front lines and making sure they have the supplies needed. Warfare is something loved by anybody who likes politics and history, and that's the player base for Paradox and strategy games, simply put. It does not have to be the most defining element of the game, but it does need to matter, and it does need to have player agency. The game fails to include that. This game feels empty. I'm deeply reminded of the launch of Crusader Kings 3. There was just no flavor to the game, and it really made it hard to play continuously. Characters have only vague traits, countries have a joke of a paragraph description in the main menu, if you're lucky, journal entries, which are clearly intended to be the means of conveying to the player flavor events, are almost all generic. There's not flavor, which really is what creates narrative stories and ties you to your nation, characters, and games. Unfortunately, from what we have seen in the first immersion pack with France just released, Voice of the People, it's clear that this is likely on purpose in order to have them add, piece by piece, flavor to countries. And given Voice of the People was $15, that is bullshit. The most gaping feature is quite clear: colonialism. The Berlin Conference is one of the most important meetings and moments of the Victorian Age, and probably in history. In it, the nations of Europe collectively decided who got what in the scramble for Africa, as they seized vast regions of the continent wholesale, divvying up land and creating empires. The technological advanced status of Europe and warlike nature of their leaders made this bound to happen. Already at the start of the game, the early parts of colonies were in development and, in some cases, had been for a long time. This is a nuanced and highly impactful part of the time period and history, which is in the game technically. You have a law that allows you to choose to colonize or not, and can then start colonies. These give you bits of land which expand with time at varying rates. Certain regions are locked behind tech, which makes a mockery out of the dangers and struggles of dealing with disease and the geographical issues of colonialism in Africa, as well as other regions. There's no system for claims, for conferences, for buying and selling and trading territories, nor the difficulties of administering such distant and dangerous pieces of land. It's a joke. And to point out the most obvious, the AI. Single player is almost impossible to play at present because other countries who are not the player act so ignorantly. Their actions make no sense, there's no historical relevance, and it frankly just seems random at best, if not just downright poorly made. After all those glaring issues, you may be thinking to yourself, what on earth is good that can make this game playable or innately worth continuing? This game is the most paradoxical I have seen in strategy. It has so much wrong with it, but what it does well is both unique and shockingly impressive in design. The vision for this game, again, is about people and how the pillars of the game interact and change their lives. So let's start with that. Population in this game is amazing. Victoria 2 put in a whole population system into a game title for really, I'd say, the first time ever in an actually interesting way. All people in this game are put into broad categories based on religion, culture, and wealth primarily, with the other two most important features being their employment status, thus job, as well as their standard of living. The game allows one to use demographic information, as well as economic and political status to simulate a person abstractly for their impact on society and nations as a whole. We all as people are infinitely complex, although our similarities can cover this at times. Whereas a game like Crusader Kings allows one to see personality traits, stress levels, and the quirks that make us unique as people, Victoria 3 abstracts us on a macro level. It's our profession and therefore wealth, and through that political opinions that matter and change nations and the world. The game simulates millions of people and how together they form movements, demand change, or perhaps are simply trying to get by and pay for their children's lives and livelihood. This game is their story, and your decisions will change every single one of their lives for better or worse. No game has ever done it on this scale before. This game is beautiful. There's no other way to put it. There have been a lot of jokes about how it kind of looks like a mobile game, but honestly, I really think that in itself is a joke. People who play strategy games love maps. I know I do. I'm looking at my walls right now and I see at least 4 of them. It's not a problem, I just really like maps. They allow one to see the world through an infinite number of lenses, which convey a moment in history. The top-down look at the map is amazingly well done and flows well. As soon as you, of course, download Lord Lambert's lovely mod, which removes the annoying clouds. Zooming in, unlike every other strategy game on the market, you will see a living world. The buildings you and your actions create appear slowly on the game map. You can see trains and boats appear as you grow them and based on how many there are. The terrain is fantastically done and truly feels alive, and the cities grow with time and change. Not only that, but as you develop and exploit resources of the world, the damage to the planet begins to appear, like overmining or deforestation. The loading screens have incredible art, the events have immersive and fantastic scenes, and really, it all just fits together, making the experience really aesthetic. Paradox in recent years has tried to make their games more approachable, whilst also retaining their complexity and depth. This is no easy thing to do. Crusader Kings 3 was the first to really try and do this, and did succeed for the most part. Victoria 3 absolutely did. There are lots of menus, but the ones you truly need are fairly easy to find after you understand the core of the game. In addition, it has the best tutorial out there for any Paradox game, which to be fair, isn't a very high bar, though it could have been much better. Paradox also released a whole series of solid tutorial videos on YouTube before launch, which did help. And of course, the UI itself is really fun to look at and use, being slightly intuitive. The diplomatic play system has been quite contentious, and like so many things in this game, is a case of a fantastic idea implemented poorly. The biggest issue at present is that it only allows war goals to be set at the start, unlike Victoria 2, where you could add them in the middle, though for a much higher infamy cost. This frankly needs to be added back in some form, or at least make the process more interesting and dynamic. That out of the way, the core system is great. It gives you a seeable lead up to wars where nations can back down or exacerbate the conflict. This needs to be expanded upon, like many diplomatic features, but it's safe to say it in itself is a much more interesting way to see conflicts play out. In other Paradox games, you just get to have a claim and start the war, which feels very two-dimensional. In Victoria 3, a war is not set entirely on your terms. You may instigate it, but the situation can quickly become something you did not want, which is the history of warfare. The mental math of other games where you make sure you are on the winning side and have more allies just really doesn't apply here, and that's a great way to approach this game. Economics in Victoria 3 is done fantastically. Basic economics is just supply and demand. I am dramatically oversimplifying, at least in our world and system. How many people want something versus how many is produced, and what is the difference in these two factors? The game puts us in very well. Goods produced versus goods needed for things like the population's innate demand, the factory's need, and trade all complicate things and make them quite complex. All your people will have need for goods, which can only be met by their wages if they pay enough, meaning many of them cannot get by with what they need. This will vary dramatically, and the effects of your political and economic policies are quite clear immediately. All you have to do is go to your population information to see the changes as you pass new laws or change them. What makes the economic system so alive, though, is how it is incorporated so intrinsically with the political system. Politics and economics are the focus of the game, and they do a great job of showing that. The trade laws drastically change both your imports and exports and the global economy as a whole. Your economic laws themselves completely transform the manner in which you develop and who benefits, having a huge effect on your people and therefore nation. But my absolutely favorite part of the game is the political mechanics. This is something I have wanted to see in a video game for as long as I can remember. Getting by with options like the Democracy series, which although fun, had little replayability, has been rough. Victoria 3 is, in my opinion, already the best political simulator available, despite its bugs and need for further depth. Leaders matter. Interest groups based on wealth, religion, and moral values push for power and form parties organically, now that some bugs have been fixed, but need improvement. Your laws are not yours to choose, as movements and outright revolution are on the table if you do not listen to people's desires. The wealth and pops themselves are what decide interest, showing an amazingly well thought out connection between wealth and political ideology, as well as activism as a whole. The developers want everything to tie to people and society, and of course it must be politics that do this. The game is deceptive in telling you how interwoven the game truly is. When you get into the details of the politics and the population, it's just so complex and everything ties together. Laws themselves are not just a button click, they require support and time to discuss and pass, with the possibility of failure. This part of the game is what made me really stop and take a moment when I first looked at it and played, surprised by frankly how well done it was, despite like all of this game needing more depth. I like the vision this game has for the military. It's a natural one to take, honestly. Politics and economics, a game about society and how you and your people function internally first and interact with the world secondly. War has always been important, if not defining, in every part of history, and this period is no different. The game is set right after the end of the Napoleonic Wars and ends when historically the First World War occurs. But war does not need to be the focus of the game to be both meaningful and fun. Unfortunately, this game fails on the latter. It's just not fun, due to the annoyance of bugs and stress of having really no ability to support your military effectively in achieving victory. When you add micromanagement into the game, it dominates both playstyle and focus, out of necessity. In every Paradox game, I find that when I'm at war, everything else is set to the side, and the conflict becomes everything, because it has to be. That can be very fun, especially in games like Hoi 4, where that's what we're there for. In this game, the purpose of war is to be on a macro scale. Nations focus on personnel, training standards, doctrine, logistics, diplomatic support, the macro zones of control, technological development programs, and espionage, or they should, in theory, with this style. This can all be done at the macro level, requiring the micromanagement of the big choices and decisions, not like troop movements or division design. Going this route is radical. It has never been in a Paradox game before, and was a massive risk to take. Paradox prides itself in innovating, but to do so sloppily, I honestly am blown away at how poorly this was done. Which leads me to ask what may be the main suspect for this, and honestly, it's probably DLC. That being said, I love the vision for military, to be able to have something we can get to focus on in conjunction with the other macro elements of the game that is so unique. To define the purpose and nature of our militaries, giving them extreme variety in style and tactics, is a game I did not know I wanted. And now I have a fever. And the only thing that can help is more macro military mechanics. Fix this, Paradox, for a strategy game's sake and for the success of your game, because the way you launch such an interesting concept is disrespectful to the people who came up with it and to your community, who you know very well love warfare. This ties into the biggest issue with Victoria 3 and how I find few who will openly advocate for it and its vision. I do love this game, like I once loved Victoria 2. I have 500 hours at least in the game that came before this. At the end of it, I was left with a sense of lost hope and anger for a company abandoning such a similar project. And I'm worrying that may happen here, like many players, and how you should also be worried if you're thinking about buying this game. Victoria 3 was a buggy mess on launch, and if it had made a shallow copy of the game that came before, or just the game in general, I think many others, including myself and including you, would be able to simply label it a failure and walk away. But this game does the worst possible thing. It manages to show you what it's supposed to be while drowning that hope and vision in a sea of problems. This is nothing new to games in the industry. Look back over the last few years and you will see so many great titles mired in controversy and anger for the same reason. The balls it takes to charge people $50 for the base game, given where things are at, is frankly madness and has made many people angry. Paradox, the publisher for this game, has lost a huge amount of respect for its fan base, and I think strategy games in general, due to the poor quality of release, as it should. Part of this, honestly, is due to the hype generated by the community and the company. Part is due to the cult status of Victoria 2 and the hardcore competitive multiplayer community that advocates for strange features. But the biggest issue is just the execution. Victoria 2, the predecessor to this game, was released in a very similar way, but had the excuse of being made at a time when Paradox was a small company. This publisher is now $1 billion evaluation, $4 billion in 2021 and around 2.6 right now. They have already made back their creation costs on Victoria 3 in revenue. In order to rebuild trust with you, with me, and with strategy gamers and anyone who wants to buy this game or who has bought it, they need to fix it for free. If the DLC that is always marketed as optional in this industry is what fills in the gaps and fixes the game, it will be a defining moment for this series and for Paradox Interactive. So, should you buy this game? Do I recommend it to you? Honestly, probably not. For most people watching, I really just recommend you wait. Don't give money to a game that is not complete, and don't enable a company to release half-baked alpha games and get away with it. Game companies are incentivized only by the economics of their products. Low sales mean that they will have to pause and ask why. Wait until it goes on sale or improves. You may have to wait for a while. For those of you like me who are desperate for a political and economic simulator, this game is it. I hate that Paradox is a monopoly and the moat they have constructed around grand strategy through quality, as well as frankly just buying out the competition, did not exist, but it does. This game is fun, replayable, and the mods made for it already are great and look to be amazing. Hell, there's an amazing Cold War mod already in alpha, which will be just fantastic when complete. There's an EU4 era mod in a similar place at present. This game will not lack from player content, but for the DLC released and for the improvements on the base game, the quality needs to come up, and we don't know if that will happen. It's not there, and you as the player should not stand for crap like this. To sum it up simply, great vision, poor execution, fix your game, Paradox, and to you watching, just wait unless you really need this game.